Okay, last time I was talking about or got into this whole issue of sort of some of the functions of art. And so I want to go into more detail on that, but also sort of the importance of symbolism in a whole mess of ways which we don't really think about. But you have to remember symbolism is one of those incredibly tricky concepts because when we look at the world around us, we invariably see it symbolically. And what we don't really understand, of course, is there's no relationship between the actual thing and what we symbolically interpret, in other words, the meaning we put on it. And this is why when you go somewhere else, to another society, and another system, you have so much difficulty figuring out what the hell's going on because the symbolic reference that you're used to aren't there. And yet there's obviously a bunch of stuff that is symbolic that you don't really understand. In fact, let me do a visual of that first. This is a really good reference site. This is a guy named Rambalak. This is a YouTube channel. This has become a very popular thing, especially in Japan, but you'll see it in Hong Kong and other places where people are basically using stabilized GoPros and literally just walking around the streets. And especially from an anthropological standpoint, this is the closest thing you can actually get to actually being an anthropologist in another place. And in some ways, it actually has a huge advantage. My life and my work in Second Life is similar to this, because when you record stuff, you can go back and watch it again and again. If you're actually experiencing this in traditional anthropology, so if you're actually here in Tokyo walking through Shinjuku, in real time, and you're not recording this, then you're depending on your memory and whatever notes you can manually write down, or however you're going to record this stuff, mentally, to gain your impressions. And of course, you just quickly get overwhelmed. The great advantage of something like this Rambalak or something like his walks, and there's a bunch of folks that do this, is that you can actually watch it again and again, so you can actually deconstruct some of the layers of it. Now, the reason I mention that is of course, now we're in Tokyo. This is as of a couple of weeks ago. And so we're just going to watch just a couple of seconds or a few seconds of this, but when we're looking around here, assuming you're not familiar with, with the Japanese sort of cultural ethos, notice that everything here is different. And I would include, of course, this also just means the clothes that people are wearing, the way people are moving, and most importantly, what you visually see, and also, of course, what you hear or don't hear. Okay. So, I mean, again, from an anthropological standpoint, the advantage of YouTube and GoPro have just, revolutionized in some ways the way that we can look at things. But the key here is, if you're not familiar with Japanese society, it's a whole mess of symbols. There's a bunch of stuff that's obviously symbolic, but the meaning can oftentimes escape you. For example, the red lanterns indicate, food or drink establishments, and the particular type of lanterns, the shape of the lanterns, and the number of lanterns tells you about the type of place it is. The signage in many cases is tied in very complicated ways to standardized views of what things should be. The idea of what we call the plastic food, the food that you see in the windows. One of the side effects of this is, unlike American advertising and Japanese advertising, what you get in the dish should look exactly like what you see in the window. In American advertising, I don't think there's a hell of a lot of correlation between what you might see in it and what you actually get. In Japan, restaurants can get totally yelped out if a dish comes up and it doesn't look like this when I ordered that. So there's a whole different type of engagement of symbolism, and notice how it includes things like the street. What you've got is the idea of pedestrians, the idea of streets, the idea that you decorate sidewalks. And, Shinjuku's a busy, popular place, but you can go, he just did one a couple of days ago in Kawagoe over here. And here, that's not a huge stomping place. And yet you see the amount of time and money invested in things like sidewalks. They're only aesthetic. This serves no functional purpose. Well, it does a little bit, but its function is aesthetics. The idea that you actually have that walking surfaces should be attractive. Now, the only place we see that here would be, for example, in Waikiki. But the idea that you do the streets, for example, and here in Kaimuki Palolo like this, people be like, well, why would you spend the money on that? Because symbolically, streets aren't a big thing in the United States. Streets are a huge thing in Japan. Streets are neighborhoods are the way that people identify, and this is a neighborhood. On one hand, it's a part of downtown Tokyo. It's one of the most active probably places on the planet urban-wise. But on the other hand, for the people for a lot of people here, this is their neighborhood. This is the place they identify with. And if they're from this area, they know everyone in this neighborhood. They shop in this neighborhood. They interact with these folks. So it's a very different sense of place that Americans would have, and that's actually reinforced by everything you see here and hear here. But it's not part of a world we're familiar with. So much of what you see here might look foreign or strange or different, and that's the way it should be, because what you're actually looking at is a different symbolic set. And much of this stuff doesn't translate. Knowing what this says doesn't really help you understand what that light means. And so again, this is the important thing about symbolism. Symbolism is putting meaning on things, but there's no correlation between the meaning and the thing. You can't look at the object and figure out what it means, to Japanese, for example, in many cases. So let's do this. Since a classic example of this would be currency. Here, I don't know if you guys can see this. I'll show it pretty well. This is a reproduction of a Chinese coin. This focus is better than I thought about. So this dates back to the, I think this is Qin. This is a reproduction of a Qin dynasty coin. So this is I don't remember what this would be worth, but this dates back, if it was an original one, this would be 2,000 years old. The first, Chinese dynasty, Qin dynasty. Now this is made out of bronze, and bronze is actually a very complicated metal. It's very hard to make, and it requires a lot of resources, copper and zinc and a bunch of other antimony. So it's a complicated metal, and it was pretty rare. And scarcity is oftentimes a part of what currency we normally think of as currency. Here's again a reproduction. I could never afford the real. This is probably something you're more familiar with. This is what, if you go treasure hunting, you're looking for. This is a copy of what's called a Spanish doubloon, or more accurately, a real. And this is what the currency was of imperial Spain during the Spain were, Columbus's Spain would have controlled large parts of the planet. This would have been made out of silver. The silver would have come from largely Mexico or Peru or Chile. And this was basically what funded the Spanish Empire. And again, the key here is the fact that it's made out of a metal. Silver is not a particularly useful metal. It's an attractive metal, but it's not a particularly functionally useful metal. There's not a lot you can do with silver that you actually need to do with it. So it's not a particularly, unlike say iron or even bronze, which you can make weapons and tools out of. It's not a hell of a lot you can do with silver, but it was considered rare, and that was what sort of made it worthwhile. This is a copy of a British sovereign. So this would be in gold. This dates from the 19th century. Well, I should say the original would date from the 19th century. And in a context, you want to put in a context, one of these would buy you a horse, or maybe half a carriage, and maybe a handful of these would buy you a house. This would be what you might get if you worked really hard and you had a good job. You might get one of these, every couple of months. So again, gold is an interesting metal because it doesn't corrode in many ways. It has some utility, especially in electrical stuff, but again, you can't make tools out of it. It serves no particular function. And if you think of a dollar bill, what you've got then is something made out of paper. Now, the other thing that makes any of these valuable, there's actually nothing different between these three currencies, except the value that's placed on them by the people that use them. Now, ironically, in the period when the bronze coins were in use, they had access to silver, but it never occurred to them to make coinage out of it. They used silver for other things. And they had access to gold, but they made thread out of it for decorative purposes. It never occurred to make coinage out of gold. So, the money system was in this particular thing. And what this basically said in all these cases, everyone agreed at what this was worth. If this would buy you a lunch, then that's because I pay the guy that's making the lunch, I give him one of these, he makes the lunch for me and gives it to me because I paid for it. And what he can then do is he can then take this money and go to the guy who makes noodles for him. And he gives him that and he gets a pile of noodles. The guy that makes the noodles goes out and gives it to a farmer that gives him the wheat that he makes the noodles out of. So the only reason this works is because everyone in the system agrees on what this represents. So this is entirely symbolic. The gold coin is no more real than the bronze coin. They're only real because in the system they're a part of, these were accepted as symbolic references to basically labor and objects, which is one reason why you very frequently find in this case, of course, it's got actually Queen Victoria or King George or something on it. So actually, if you're a part of a political system, you make sure that the important symbols in the political system are on this particular object, which then basically vets the acceptance of the value of it. But if you think about it, at some points, these are all metal. So at some point, they actually have, functional utility. You can actually use them for something. You could use the metal to make jewelry or, or maybe in bronze case, a tool. When you think of this, it again fits what we said before. It's got an image on it of a political party. You've got all sorts of very complex symbolism, which I've never bothered to figure out, especially this thing with the pyramid. God knows what that's about. But of course, what it says here is this is worth $1. But of course, what that means is everyone in the United States or everyone in the system that's using this currency has to agree on what this is worth. Does this buy you a lunch? Does it buy you a house? What do you get for that? Well, it's only because everyone agrees on what a dollar is worth. But if you think about it, you oftentimes tend to think of the difference, and somehow these are different. The metal is somehow more reliable than the dollar is because this is metal and it's scarce, and this is a paper, it's cloth paper, so it's not scarce. But the reality is even the metal is only worth what we collectively agree on its value. So when you're looking at currency or money in any way, shape, or form, it's always based on shared perception, which is one reason why in the 21st century, you can see the movement of digital money, the various types of Bitcoins that are around. And just as a note, China, as of this year, I believe July, is starting up a program where they're basically going to convert to a digital economy. They're going to quit printing cash. They're going to move to a digital system where you basically use your phone or whatever, and you basically, that's how you acquire or transfer funds. So they're trying to convince the population that digital money is just as real as this was 2,000 years ago. Might be familiar. That's the whole issue that Alibaba suddenly got slammed, or no, Jack Ma got slammed all of a sudden a couple of weeks ago because he was actually in charge of this, and they were going to make I think $132 billion by their IPO, and he got wiped because he mouthed off about the financial system in China, and they shut the whole thing down. But they're still going ahead with the currency. That's supposed to be in place by either the end of December or early January next year. So they're basically decided that money in this form is since it was always symbolic anyways, there's no difference between this and using Apple Pay or Samsung Pay or whatever version of a pay system you have on your phone. It's all the same thing. And if you think about it, especially now with COVID, the amount of movement of actual cash in the sense of physical currency is getting increasingly uncommon. People using their cards, use your swipe, your debit card, your credit card, whatever, and that's how you make your payments. And of course, if you buy stuff on Amazon, as everyone does now, there's no way you could send in money in an envelope to Amazon to pay for something. It's all digital. You pay most of your bills on your paycheck comes into a digital account, it moves out of a digital account to somewhere else, and in that entire process, no one sees any money. Your company doesn't put physical cash in the bank for you. When you take the money out to pay a bill, say your credit card bill, you're not taking physical money out and putting it in a little bag and taking it down to the credit card company, which might be in Tierra del Fuego or God knows where the hell they are. So the entire process is in the process of becoming digitalized. The scary thing is what people tend to forget is all of a sudden if people decide that this isn't worth lunch. If all of a sudden people can't agree on what the value of this actually is, then all it becomes is what it is right now. It becomes a prop in my office. And it's just a chunk of metal. It ceases to be a currency. If suddenly, you were able to turn lead into gold, the old alchemy thing, then, the idea of a gold coin would be irrelevant other than the fact that it doesn't tarnish. Because if you could have a ton of it, then there's no scarcity, so it's not worth anything. This is a big issue if you ever look at things, for example, like diamonds, in terms of artificial scarcity for value. Just a very trippy idea of wealth and property and value. So it sort of gets us back in this whole idea of art, because to a certain extent, you could argue that money is art. There's a tremendous amount of art involved in things like a coin, or for example, especially this Qin dynasty thing. This takes a lot of work to make these things, to cast these things, for someone to actually work up the reverse wax casting to originally make the original master of this. So when you're looking at things like currency, there's oftentimes some real interesting sort of relationships to the idea of art, because all this stuff is part of the idea of symbolism, things that have been given meaning. And money is probably one of the most valuable, and it gives you an insight in just exactly how powerful shared symbolic meaning is. Or, for example, that little walk through a little bit of Shinjuku, the power of shared messaging, of shared meaning through symbols. And notice how it's also incredibly efficient. Again, that lantern in that Shinjuku, in the front of that Shinjuku restaurant, says a whole mess of stuff to someone who understands the symbolic meaning. It's incredibly efficient versus if you had to put that in text, or you had to talk about it. So one of the huge things to remember about symbols is they're very efficient forms of communication, and oftentimes very dense, or as the Hawaiians would say, kauna. There's a tremendous number of levels of meaning in that. So for example, in some place like Shinjuku, which is about more just 21st century as you can possibly get, the fact that you use traditional restaurant lanterns to mark a restaurant is actually saying a whole mess of stuff to other Japanese, not just that it is a restaurant, but also this is a Japanese restaurant, it's got a Japanese owner, they understand what Japanese want. I mean, it's a whole mess of messaging that's occurring just in that lantern in front of a place. That, to be honest, most of the people that see it are never going to actually think about it, but it's still talking to them. Symbolic messaging is incredibly powerful. It's an incredibly efficient process. And of course, it can also be used as to keep people out. You can use messages where you intentionally set it up so only people inside can understand it and people outside can't. This is one of the main things of things like tatau. Tatau is in many cases, tatau, and especially would be true of traditional tatau here in Polynesia, was a form of insider-outsider. Insiders, in the terms of the members of the system, could understand both the markings on the body and where they were put and why they were put there and what that says about you. A whole list of very complicated things. Easiest, probably the most modern context would be, for example, let's say just Hawaiian tatau. So you have, in many cases, half your body in tattoos. And that says something about your allegiance, your family, your relationship to the high chief. I mean, a whole mess of stuff that literally you don't have to say a word. You walk down the path and your body is saying it for you. And everyone that can read that understands what it means. Now, if Europeans show up, or Americans show up, or tourists show up, or I don't care what it is, if it's the 21st century and you're Hawaiian and you tattoo half your body, notice how in that case there's a whole mess of things you're doing now in 2020 that wasn't the case in, say, 1760. In 1760, everyone understood the messaging. It was a shared common component, in the same way that lantern is in Tokyo. In 2020, if you go and you have your body tattooed, which is real typical, for example, the Big Island and parts of East Maui. So literally from the top of your forehead and all the way down to your feet would be a pattern. And that pattern would be your allegiance to your clan, your relationship again to the high chief, your position and status in society. All that stuff would be marked on your body as a way to reference all those things. But the problem you have in 2020 is, for one thing, you couldn't get onto this campus because if you're wearing a malo, you can't. That's considered exposure for guys. So malos except in culturally appropriate places like hula contest. You try to walk down the street in Honolulu and the cops will probably stop you. And technically they should. And if you try to go into a shop or you try to come here on campus, they'd say, I'm sorry, you got to put more clothes on. They can't just literally walk around in basically what's, basically a sexual packaging wrap. So in that situation, despite the fact that you want to show your body, that's actually important because that's what you're trying to talk about, you wouldn't be allowed to in the modern context in most cases. Now, on top of that, with the exception of very, very few people, and I would say probably in the hundreds, almost no one could understand the symbolism. They couldn't read it. Even people that have traditional symbolism put on them oftentimes have to go through a tremendous amount of effort to actually figure out where the symbol should be and what they should be, because it's not in common context. It's not part of the shared symbolic messaging that we use in the 21st century. A McDonald's sign, oh yeah. Tatau on the body, no. And this gets very complicated. If I go back to East Maui, for example, you get some folks that put the traditional tatau on in the traditional places in the traditional ways. But you can also go down, you can go down to Kapahulu, for example, there's a place down here, a couple of places in Kaimuki, and I can get tribal tataus put on my body that in many cases are actually part of the same designs. But I have no idea what the traditional meaning is. And to be honest, I don't really care. I just like them because they look tribal or look ethnic, or, I just like the style of it or whatever. In other words, it fits the aesthetics of what I want to say, or maybe how I want to message myself. But the weird thing is, depending on who's looking at it, they're going to get entirely different messages from what I'm saying. And that might be intentional. If I want to be really seriously aggressive about my Hawaiian identity in the 21st century, putting on a family tatau, and I got family that do this, they've got the tatau on, and they intentionally don't want anyone to understand. What they want is people to see them and know that they don't know what the message means. So you can use this as exclusivity. A lot of gang graffiti that you see on the sides of freeways and stuff, that's intended for you to see it, but it's also intended that you're not going to understand it, because they want you to know that you don't understand it. And that means that it's sort of like a secret handshake. It's a way for them to mark something or to say something and know that you're clueless. So symbolism is as much used to keep folks out as it is to include. And symbolism in the 21st century, I'd say especially in 2020, is replete with this. You can see this in this whole political discussion leading up to the elections. The symbolism being used both to include and also to exclude. It's just massive on every in every image that you see. And that's very much a part of this idea of what is art. Is, for example, a mask like this art? Maybe, maybe not. What about this one? A shaman odd mask. Is that art? Well, I don't know. But in some cases, they're intentionally done as art. You wear something like this in the right context, with a very obviously sort of Hawaiian, sort of vaguely tatau image of a honu. And what you're saying is something about, what you want to be seen as. In other cases, that might not be appropriate. So mask wearing right now in late 2020 is becoming a real interesting aspect of both of art, but most importantly of symbolism. People are starting to realize you can do a lot of messaging in what you have to wear on your face, in the same way that what you put in your hair, the color of your hair, the way you shape your hair, almost every aspect of your body, and the things you put on your body have the advantage not only of being symbolic and referring both what group you want to be seen as a part of and what you want to be seen personally as, but also has the great advantage that it's portable. You can take it with you. And this is one of the important aspects of things like what are called body art by anthropologists, is the fact that we use symbolic messaging so much and we understand so little of it. And in many cases, the only time we actually realize the messaging is when we go somewhere else and the people there don't recognize the messaging we got. And we look around and we realize we don't understand their messaging. Art and the display of symbols is incredibly complicated. It's invariably based on a whole set of parameters. Now in American society, this is typical of a lot of the modern world, is what you find is the idea of art is very much tied to the idea of conspicuous consumption. And this has to go back to when we were talking, ages ago about things like nuclear family. You have to remember in the American system, if your referent group of social kin is very small, then the vast majority of people you're going to interact with, there'll be some that would be friends or acquaintances, but the vast majority of people will be strangers. In an American society, given the value system, which is sort of the Calvinist Puritan type of thing, individualism is a key component. But one of the other aspects, again tied to this sort of, Calvinist Christian morality, is the idea that you have to be successful. And being successful with relatives is one thing, because relatives know who you are, they know what you've done. So your success is going to be actually based on your sort of performance record, if you want to think of it. If you're talking about success relative to strangers, that becomes an entirely different thing. So success with strangers could be, well, this isn't, but we'll say, for example, this is we'll say this is a $20,000 Seiko watch. That Seiko watch wouldn't keep any better time, okay, it's keeping the right time, than this thing does, which I picked up, I think, in Kyoto, yeah. So this is a watch, and it works, it keeps time. A $20,000 Seiko wouldn't do any better job of keeping time. The whole reason for a $20,000 watch versus what I think was like a $60 watch from Uniqlo or something, is the fact that the $20,000 watch, when you wear it, screams, I cost $20,000. And the reason that you're using that particular watch is you want people that don't know you to have to assess what you are by virtue of the things that you carry on you. So in the same way that this coin says something about wealth or power in a group that buys into the value of the coin, the stuff that you put on your body in many cases, especially in American society, is very heavily tied to the way that you want to see yourself presented to people that don't know you. So that you're going to literally look at someone, you're going to actually just basically assess their value by virtue of what they have on them. Or if you're wearing logo wear, by virtue of what group or what thing they want to be referred to. So you can get someone who's obviously not in shape physically, who's wearing some, like all Nike athletic gear. Well, on one hand, it might be for comfort, but it's also very likely, if everything's got Nike plastered all over it, that they want to be identified with someone who's athletic or likes, sports, et cetera, et cetera. And they're messaging that to people they don't know by virtue of what they put on their body. So one of the aspects of various forms of symbolic art, and very important in modern society, is the idea of conspicuous consumption, the idea that you conspicuously wear or use things for the purpose of making performance for others. But of course, it's only going to work if they understand the symbolism that's intent in what you've got. So again, this is based on shared concepts. Yeah, I'm not going to bother going over some of the rest of the stuff. It's sort of interesting, but I don't see it's really that big of a deal. Oh yeah, the one that is sort of interesting, because especially stereotype now, is that in Japanese society, for example, when you became married, women would blacken their teeth. This was true right into the 1920s, I think it is, maybe 1930s, I can't remember exactly when. And so the blackening your teeth meant that you were actually making a statement of your position in the family. So you actually, in some ways like tatao, you're basically modifying a part of your body to make a statement of your position in the system, and in this case, position of the kin group. And just as a note, this is one reason why you still today will see when Japanese, especially Japanese women laugh, they invariably, if their mouth is open, they hide their mouth. And that's a reflection of this whole period, both of the idea of blackened teeth, but also in Japanese society by the 1930s, 40s, when this became considered unattractive. What you had was the idea that then you developed this social habit basically of hiding the mouth so people couldn't judge you by virtue of what your teeth looked like. So it isn't hiding bad teeth in the sense of, they're crooked or something like that. It's literally hiding what color your teeth were by virtue of the way the system had, intended it to be at one point in time. Okay. Yeah, let's stop there. I'll do the digital thing in the last post on this.